So welcome, everybody. It's very good to see you here this evening for a kind of second instalment from John Daniels. And without more ado, John, I'm going to hand over to you to give us a little bit of a catch up on what you did in your first instalment and then give us more depth on those you had to rush. Over to John.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Barbara, for those words of introduction again. And welcome to you all this evening. Good to see so many of you, and a happy Easter to you as we move into this new season together. Let me share my screen with you without further ado, like that. And then I'll get the presentation up and we'll kick that off like this. Hopefully now you can all see my screen. And so, yes, running out of steam, that's what's happened to that poor chap there. Life after fossil fuels, living well with less. I just want to say a few words by way of recap about last week, and then I shall, as Barbara indicated, plunge into the latter part of the talk, which I had to rather rush through. The first thing I wanted to underscore for us is the way in which, over the course of human history, the course of Homo sapiens, going back 200,000 or 300,000 years, something like that, we are living in utterly exceptional times in terms of the rate at which we're drawing down energy to sustain human society at the moment. Something like, an order of magnitude or more than our foraging ancestors used. And it's worth remembering that actually for the vast majority of human history, we have got by a much less energy than we currently consume. But that really is worth noting, and we'll come back to this point at the very end. And then this quote from George Orwell, which I just think is so significant, really. Writing in 1937, our civilization is founded on coal, he said, writing back there, completely than one realizes until one stops to think about it. These days, it wouldn't be so much coal, it would be oil that he'd be referring to if he was speaking today. We are critically dependent on oil, not least because it remains the main means by which we get people and stuff from A to B. And global primary energy supply over the course of the last 200 years has increased out of all proportions, 25 times faster now we consume energy than we did back in 1820. And as you can see, the different fossil well represented there, coal, oil, and gas. And the thing I wanted us to notice at that side in particular is the way in which when a new fuel supply comes along, it doesn't typically displace prior energy supplies, rather it adds to them. Prior energy supplies only disappear out of the picture typically if they become unavailable or for whatever other reasons. But as you can see, we are drawing down colossal amounts of energy now as a civilization compared to what we were doing really even just a few decades ago. And this has all made us very rich. Not all of us equally rich, but certainly in the global north, by and large, we have done very well out of it over the course of the last century. And that's a chart of primary energy supply against gross world product, a very poor measure of prosperity. Nonetheless, that's an indication of the difference that the last 200 years have made in terms of how well off most of us are now in this part of the world compared to our near ancestors, and how that's so strongly correlated with the amount of energy that we have managed to capture on a regular basis. So cheap, abundant fossil fuel energy has transformed standards of living. So I then moved on, having said those introductory words, to look at the Zero Carbon Britain report from the Centre for Alternative Technology in Mid Wales. Do commend it to you. Do have a look through it. It's available online. And we looked at this particular slide, which is from the report, and I said there's a lot that we could examine here, but two things to notice in particular. First of all, where the bulk of the energy comes from in the Zero Carbon Britain scenario, which is from wind power, particularly offshore wind power, because that's where most of the wind is. And the second thing is how much less energy we end up having available to us, even under this scenario, which is, a very positive optimistic, upbeat scenario in many ways, 60% reduction in terms of final energy demand. And that's where the living well with less idea comes in. The notion that we're moving into an era now which is going to be quite different in terms of the amount of energy that's available to us compared to what we've become used to over recent decades. So I will now skip on very quickly to the latter section of the presentation, which I headed enough steam. You'll remember that perhaps I compared the decent living energy measurement that's come out of a paper by someone called Millward Hopkins and his co-authors, and made the observation that actually from a technical point of view, we really only need a fraction of the energy we currently use in order to live a decent standard of life in this country. And what I've done in that chart there is to compare our actual final energy consumption per person in 2021 with a sort of scenario that the zero carbon Britain people are commending to us, and then again the decent living energy calculation from the Millward Hopkins et al. Paper. And as you can see, we could get by technically on a lot much less than we actually do use at the moment. However, the challenge is to manage the political and economic implications of making such a radical change in the ways of life that will be required in order to achieve this. And the authors of the paper freely admitted. So this is this is part of the challenge we're having to deal with. So enough energy, okay, enough steam, but what about enough stuff? Because it turns out that a world which is powered by renewable energy will need a lot more stuff out there to actually capture the energy from the wind and the sun in order to channel it into human society. And you may remember that I compared the requirements of zero carbon Britain with the amount of stuff that there is in the new Wembley Stadium. So that, for example, looking at the onshore wind turbine capacity, zero carbon Britain would need some 63 Wembley stadiums worth of concrete. And so far as offshore turbines were concerned, that would require 1,630 Wembley stadiums worth of steel. So we're talking about a lot of stuff simply in order to put the machines in place to provide the bulk of the energy for a zero carbon Britain according to this scenario. And this is a slide which I don't think I dwelt on last time, but it's a quote from a couple of quotes from papers by a French researcher called Vidal and his co-authors. And they focus particularly on steel, cement, aluminium, and copper, which are the basic building blocks of industrial civilization. And they came to this conclusion. Our results show that greater amounts of energy are needed for the construction and maintenance of fully decarbonized electricity generation infrastructures than for an infrastructure maintaining a fraction of the electricity produced from fossil fuels. In other words, the shift to renewables will be a source of material and energy over consumption. We're going to have to extract far more stuff out of the ground, do a lot more processing with it, and the transition itself is going to take a lot more energy if we are to move certainly to a radically decarbonized electricity energy supply. And this is from another paper which the same authors brought out around the same time. For an equivalent installed capacity, solar and wind facilities require up to 15 times more concrete, 90 times more aluminium, and 50 times more iron, copper, and glass than fossil fuels or nuclear energy. In other words, to have the same notional generating capacity, you're going to have a lot more stuff out there to do the generation under a wholly renewables regime than you would if you were still using fossils or indeed nuclear. And the the quote there in red at the top right-hand corner is particularly significant, I think. A shift to renewable energy will replace one non-renewable resource, fossil fuel, with another, metals and that's a key realization. Because the apparatus that we use for capturing wind and sunshine is rebuildable, but it's not totally renewable. in the way that that term is commonly used. Now, you may be thinking, well, hold on, maybe these machines, these solar panels, these turbines, maybe they do only have a excuse me, finite lifetime. But surely we can recycle the materials. That's one way around it. We'll come recycling a little later. I'm not going to dwell on this, but I think I talked you through this slide last time, looking at the challenges in producing high quality heat for heavy industry. Very high temperatures needed for both iron and steel manufacture and cement, and also a requirement for continuous operation. Now, there are various renewable options for that, biofuels, electricity from renewable sources, hydrogen, but the central challenge here is cost. You're looking at costs at least twice the levels that we currently have to cope with, and that of course would feed through into the experience of consumers, and everything would get more expensive. Essentially, that's the take home for that. When it comes to harnessing wind and sun, we're talking about three kind of core technologies: solar, photovoltaics, wind power, and also batteries. Because as we noticed, I won't mention this at any length this time, but last time we did notice that in the zero carbon Britain scenario, they recognized that there will be times when there's no sun and there's no wind, and how do we manage to keep ourselves on the go under those circumstances? So batteries play a key part in this, as they do, of course, in electric vehicle technology. So aluminium and copper, they're uniform, they're used everywhere. Essentially, they're the main minerals for constructing cables, transmission wires, and so forth. Cobalt and lithium are key components for current battery technologies, and rare earth metals, which we'll come back to in a moment, are essential components of electric vehicle batteries. So for directly geared, which are generally offshore wind turbines. And in a renewable future, demand for these materials will skyrocket, particularly, excuse me, under current battery technologies. The demand for cobalt and lithium could absolutely go through the roof. And I think I mentioned that according to Simon Michaud, if overnight you electrified all the cars and vans in the world, not the lorries, but just the car and the vans, you would end up using the lithium ion NMC 811 battery chemistry, at least, which is a very common one. It's, for example, if you have a Renault Zoe, that's the kind of battery you've got in it. If you were to electrify the world's vehicles overnight, then you would use up straight away 95% of the world's cobalt reserves. So we're talking, that's simply to illustrate the amount of stuff that will be required in trying to reproduce the status quo, but using renewably sourced energy rather than energy from fossil fuels. And of course, that means we're going to have to do a lot more digging to get hold of these minerals. Almost 400 new mines needed to meet future electric vehicle battery demand, according to this article from Tech Informed, which was from 2022. And that has to have implications for the natural environment. Latterly, I mean, we used to mine a lot of stuff in this country, didn't we? I mean, if you go for sort of walks in North Wales there, as my wife and I do, you come across these remnants of old lead mines and whatnot. And these days they're quite quaint, they become overgrown, and they're fairly small scale affairs for the most part, anyway. But this article from Politico in I think that was 2023, wasn't it? That's quite a recent article, again showing how it really hits home when this mining, the possibility of mining in your own backyard becomes a reality again, rather than it being something that's happening miles away in South America or in Africa. And again, the conflict, the tension, certainly between needing to access some of these key minerals and preserving aspects of God's creation is very real, particularly as I said, if it's happening in your backyard. I mentioned, I won't go into this again at any depth, but this is a study from Princeton University looking at what it would mean to effect a radical transition to renewable energy in the United States, constraining supply to be 100% renewable by 2050, eliminating fossil fuel, nuclear or carbon capture and storage, extensive end-use electrification, because that's the thing about renewable energy, is it requires massive wholesale electrification of our entire energy network. And according to this study, it would require in the US, under this scenario, increasing the amount of transmission capacity in terms of cables going around the place by a factor of 5 compared to what was in place in 2020. And in a similar analysis carried out by the International Energy Agency for the world, they reckon that moving towards a particular renewable scenario that they had in view, it would require new and replacement transmission and distribution cabling, which would be, if you sort of put it all end to end, would be enough to get you to the moon and back 110 times. Again, huge demands for copper and aluminium in particular in relation to this electrification agenda. Recycling, I think I went through this slide, excuse me, last time, so I won't repeat that exposition again at length, but simply to point out the conclusion, which is that already in some cases we are doing a lot of recycling. There's a lot of aluminium and copper which is currently recycled, but even if you look to scale up to very ambitious targets of 100% end-of-life recycling rates by 2050, you'll still be in a situation at that point of having to draw down significant portions of primary aluminium, something of the order of 40%, in order to create some new stuff that you are building in 2050. So what's not going to be viable is a radical transformation to a largely recycled society, simply because the demand is going to grow out of all proportion over the next few years. If we go down the route of electrifying the whole of society, we're going to have to find all these new cables, all these new batteries, all this new stuff to manufacture the wind turbines and so forth. Solar panels equally face a huge recycling challenge. This is from a report from a couple of years ago now. Global solar capacity is expected to grow to 4.5 terawatts by 2050. That's great. That's a lot of energy. But this will create a growing burden of photovoltaic waste that could hit, the authors of this article suggest, 80 million metric tons by the same year. And the reason for that is that these things don't last forever. The lifetime of a solar panel, with a bit of luck, is maybe 20 years or so, depending on what environment it's in. And likewise, wind turbines, 20 to 30-year lifespans, and certainly some of it can be recycled, but at the moment, very little of photovoltaic waste is in fact recycled. And this is a quote from the article, which I'll just read out to you. Many waste facilities that do photovoltaic recycling at the moment merely harvest bulk materials like aluminium frames and glass covers, which make up over 80% of the mass of a photovoltaic panel. The remaining mass is often incinerated, even though it contains elements like silver, copper, and silicon, which together account for 2/3 of the monetary value of solar panels materials. So there's scope for improving recycling there enormously, but again, the costs associated with them are significant. At the moment, it's much cheaper for solar panel manufacturers to simply dump old solar panels and create stuff from new materials than it is to really take recycling seriously. Now, that equation may well change over the years ahead, but at the moment, that's how things stand. And when it comes to mining these materials, it's getting harder and harder to access high quality output. And the reason for that, very simply, is that we've picked the low-hanging fruit first. So again, this is from an International Energy Agency report. And in the left-hand image there, under mined output, you'll see that the amount of copper and nickel the amount of mined output in absolute terms has increased quite significantly between 2010 and 2017, but the quality, which is that orange line, has gone down. In other words, the amount of actual useful copper and nickel per unit of rock has declined, essentially because the richest rock with the most copper and nickel in it has already been quarried long since. Tailings in the central image there is the tailings are basically a mixture of the waste which comes out from the mining operation. So it's fine bits of rock combined with any chemicals that have had to be pumped in to expedite the mining process. As you can see, the quantity of tailings has increased over that 7-year period, as has the amount of tailings per mined output. In other words, the amount of waste per unit of useful product has increased. And the right-hand image there on waste rock tells a similar story. Quote from Simon Michaud, the Australian energy analyst: "To phase out fossil fuels, the entire global industrial ecosystem will need to be re-engineered, retooled, and fundamentally rebuilt. And this will be perhaps the greatest industrial challenge the world has ever faced historically. And to do this," he goes on, "the energy resources available are much poorer in quality and quantity than when the current ecosystem was built in the golden age of industrialization." And there are numerous adverse consequences that follow from this inevitable increase in the human footprint on the earth, which will be required in order to affect the renewables transition. We've already touched on the not in my backyard dimension of this, but here was a report from the Harvard International Review from a couple of years ago, which looks at rare earth metals, which you'll remember are, in fact, widely used in digital technology these days, essential for electric vehicles and for direct drive offshore wind turbines. For every ton of rare earth metals produced, 2,000 tons of toxic waste are produced. And that mining is not a pretty business, whatever it is you're trying to get at the moment. But much of the mining for rare earth metals goes on in China, which leads to which are geopolitical in nature. Again, notice how often Russia and China feature in this diagram. This is where so many of the minerals that we will look to rely on for the renewable transition come from. We're not on the best of terms in this country with Russia at the minute, are we? And therefore, by extension, with China, certainly the current administration in the United States, and indeed any new Trump administration which may succeed it, are likely to become increasingly combative towards China as well. So the geopolitical situation in which we're trying to affect this renewable transition, just over the last few years, has begun to look pretty daunting, hasn't it? There are some significant additional challenges coming through from that direction. This is from a paper where the authors essentially tried to measure two things in relation to a transformation to a renewable energy future. They wanted to look at the amount of net energy which was available to society, but also the amount of additional CO2 which would be produced in affecting the transition from the current fossil fuel regime to a largely renewable future. So these authors worked out that there will be a decline of anything between 10 and 34% in the net energy available to society. That's the first thing they noticed. Net energy basically is the amount of energy that's left over from an energy production process after you've subtracted all the energy you had to spend in accessing and processing and distributing that energy in the first place. And again, it's quite a controversial area, this really, because it's quite difficult to compare renewable and fossil fuel energy sources. But as far as these authors are concerned, we would be ending up with amounts of less useful energy available to society as we affect this transition, simply because renewable energy sources, generally speaking, don't have that same richness on density of energy to offer that fossil fuels, certainly in their pomp, were able to offer. And just as disturbing is the realization that actually in order to affect this transition, we're going to have to use largely fossil fueled energy sources to build all these new wind turbines and solar panels, and to power the trucks that are going to transport the stuff around in order to put them in the right places. Anything between 70 and 395 gigatons of additional CO2, which is equivalent to anything between 2 and 11 years of our total energy-related CO2 emissions at 2021 levels. Now, that's not to say, again, we shouldn't do it. Say it isn't a cost that's, isn't worth incurring, but it is to make the point that the transition is necessarily going to involve an additional energy and CO2 footprint associated with it. What these authors did was they looked at the whole question of what happens economically as we look to make a radical transition to a renewable future. And on the left-hand side there, you've got a chart which looks at price inflation. And on the right-hand side, you've got a chart that looks at the unemployment rate. And the conclusion that the authors came to there was that as you effect a transition of this kind, then there will inevitably be an increase in energy prices. We already touched on that when we looked at that slide on high quality heat for industrial applications. There is a knock-on effect to prices, and therefore a knock-on effect relating to inflation. The unemployment rate, after an initial favorable response because of new jobs created for the green transition, the unemployment rate is anticipated to increase, which in turn negatively impacts functional income distribution. Basically, that means rich people get richer, poor people getting poorer. So again, some very significant and worrying trends emerging from this particular analysis. I spent some time looking at this last time. I won't dwell on it again, so to make the point that the human cost of accessing the minerals that are essential for the renewable transition is quite significant, particularly in places that, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which for various reasons have kind of been to hell and back several times over the course of the last several decades since independence, for a variety of reasons. And Zografov bins this quote from their paper here: despite its intentions, the Green New Deal could lead to a new form of green colonialism that will continue to sacrifice the people of the global south to maintain our broken economic model. Underscoring there, I think, the link between energy and economics. It's a fundamental link which we often overlook. And again, a recent article in Resilience making precisely that point. Again, the way in which geopolitics is interwoven with these issues is intricate and again, quite challenging to respond to, I think. So drawing to a close, this controversial paper I mentioned last time, I'll go through it again now, by Seibert and Rees from 2021, where they argued that the renewables transition is has to be understood as a shift to a radically different way of living for a human population, which almost certainly will have to be significantly reduced compared to what it is today. They argue that renewable energy can't deliver the same quantity or quality of energy fossil fuels because the espoused technologies are not renewable. I made this point earlier, they're rebuildable, but they're not renewable because we can never achieve 100% recycling, or indeed even anything close to the case of some minerals. Production from mining to installation is fossil fuel intensive, and producing them, their metals and discarding waste entails egregious social injustices and significant ecological damage. And Bill Rees is the founder of the ecological footprint analysis tool. And so you'd expect them to make this point, perhaps, that Homo sapiens, we as a species, exploiting ecosystems beyond their regenerative and assimilative capacities. And we have been since around about 1970, according to uh, the measurement that's depicted there. The only viable response, argue the authors, to overshoot is a managed contraction of the human enterprise until we arrive within the safely stable territory defined by ecological limits. So very challenging, and that generated a highly animated response from a couple of groups of enthusiastic renewable energy advocates. You can read all about it on the Energies Journal website if you want to follow through that interesting tale. I just want to offer you a quote from a French analyst who has a almost unpronounceable name, Francois Javier Chevalereau, I think it is, or something like that, who wrote this in a paper in Resilience a couple of years ago. This sums up our situation really rather well. The expected partial or total replacement this century of fossil fuels by renewables in absolute terms is something that cannot be compared with previous energy transitions. It represents far more than just the technical replacement of a set of energy sources by another set of energy sources, and amounts to a full-scale re-engineering of human civilization's metabolism, echoing the words there of Simon Michaud from earlier on. The only relevant precedents in human history are the transition from hunting and gathering societies to agricultural societies, and then the transition from agricultural societies to fossil fuel-based industrial societies. So this is a fourth age of energy consumption contemplating here. And he goes on, even with the best intentions, it's difficult to envisage that such a transition could take place without profoundly disrupting our existing political, economic, financial, and social systems, and triggering a number of positive and negative feedbacks that we can hardly foresee and probably not model at this stage. It's difficult to envisage this process would be anything but messy, destabilizing, risky, with a high potential for brutal or even violent disruptions. And it's difficult to envisage that it could be completed at low cost in a matter of just a few decades. I mean, that's boring stuff, but I would suggest a very serious comment from an person and something we need to register. So, if we're looking at energy descent, let's look at four different scenarios as offered by David Holmgren, um, the permaculture pioneer from Australia, starting with the most optimistic of his scenarios. These are all scenarios that go beyond the Green New Deal and recognize that we're looking at a future in which we're going to have to live with less energy available to us. So the first is green tech. This is a distributed power down scenario where there is a planned production of energy. So that's where the whole world comes to its senses, sobers up and realizes the party's over. We just need to scale down our human enterprise in a controlled and negotiated and humane way. It involves mass electrification, as we've seen, inevitably, using renewable energy sources. We use IT to best advantage in order to manage resources as that happens. But this is far from being simply a top-down imposition. Localized democratic infrastructure and then management decisions are retained so far as possible within that. However, things might end up being a lot less smooth than that. It could be a much rockier descent. This is where the Earth Steward scenario comes in, which envisages a bottom-up rebuild of society. The premise for this is a rapid, unplanned decline in fossil fuel production, which leads to severe global depression and indeed resource wars in some parts of the world. This envisages possibly electricity and communications grids breaking down, and local communities having to suddenly man up effectively and start taking responsibility for their own well-being in the future. So, for example, suburban landscapes might start getting re-ruralized. Open spaces might start being used for community agriculture. The kind of thing that happened during World War II, when parks were dug up to grow potatoes. And local currencies, food, car, fuel co-ops, informal household economies emerge as government, central authorities fail to maintain any semblance of order. So, and in many ways, coming from where he does, from a permaculture background, that's the scenario that I think he kind of instinctively warms to most. But what he thinks that the scenario that he reckons we're currently most likely to follow, unfortunately, is what he terms the brown tech scenario, which is all about a top-down constriction of energy supplies, in which aggressive policies maintain central power in the face of peak energy, climate change, and waning food supplies. Massive investment by corporations and governments extract the dregs of lower grade non-renewable resources and biofuels. We've already seen this with shale oil. I mean, people knew that there was shale oil available decades ago, but it was just, it was not seen to be a worthwhile thing to dig out because we had plenty of the proper stuff to live off at that time. Well, we've already seen how things are becoming more constrained, and people are having to resort to more polluting, less energy intensive fuel sources within the conventional sector. Mass migrations could be another feature of the future, as people suddenly realize that they don't have the wherewithal to maintain any kind of standard of life as these various crises take hold. And in reality, there's likely to be a growing hostility between the haves and the have-nots, and a growth in authoritarianism as governments seek to maintain law and order in the face of that. The worst case outcome is what he calls the lifeboat scenario, which, as I mentioned last time, I think is kind of like a Mad Max scenario, which it encapsulates the worst of both the brown tech and the Earth Steward scenarios: a progressive socioeconomic collapse, lots of wars at different scales, including, God forbid, the use of weapons of mass destruction as fighting over residual resources becomes acute. Famine and disease become widespread. There's a rapid, acute population decline. Cities become abandoned, gangs abound. And really, the priority becomes trying to salvage as much of our current civilization as possible as things fall about around us. And these are not Holmgren makes the point that these four scenarios are not mutually exclusive. One could easily dovetail, segue into the other in the way that's indicated there by those arrows. And unfortunately, at the bottom of the heap is the lifeboat scenario, which, if we're not very careful, we could quite conceivably end up with. So to finish, back where we started with George Orwell, our civilization is founded on coal. Now, as fossil fuels decline and renewable energy sources struggle to provide straightforward substitution, what kind of new civilization should we aim to build? What's, I suggest, not going to be possible is a maintenance of the civilization that we've known hitherto over this last several decades, under the circumstances in which we simply swap to renewable energy sources. Civilization will have to be reimagined, re-engineered, and it may all happen quite spontaneously without any, with human plans proving to be of little or no avail. But insofar as we do exercise any leverage over the future, what kind of new civilization should we aim to build on the back of this? Now, that's potentially quite an exciting agenda to work with, if also rather daunting. And in the end, for me, we go back to Genesis chapter 2 and the fundamental question of, well, what does it mean to be human anyway? What is our vocation under God, if we understand that phrase to have any meaning? And as Christians, I guess we want to say we absolutely do. And the notion of the human's role being to keep and to cultivate, to honor that which God has given us, on the one hand, and to treat it with respect and with care, but also to cultivate in the sense of nurturing it, husbanding it, and to use a rather old-fashioned word, bringing out the best of what has been entrusted to us, not only for our short-term exploitation, but in order that we can pass on to future generations a good world where they too can prosper and enact this fundamental vocation in an effective way. So, life after fossil fuels, yes, absolutely, why not? But it will, I suggest, be life which is, in the immortal words of Mr. Spock, it'll be life, but not as we know it. It will need to be quite drastically different in certain respects. And as I mentioned before, checked up some of the references that I mentioned there on the last slide of the presentation. There are various links that you can click on and yeah, pursue some of these ideas further. Right, that's it. I almost got it in half an hour, so I'm feeling sort of 50% smug about that.
Thank you so much, John. I'm so glad we had you come back to do this. It was really, really very sobering as before. Would you mind just hanging on for a little while? I'm sure there will be people who would like to
Sure.
ask you things. So please, if you want to ask John anything or say anything, put up your real hand or your virtual hand and come on in. I mean, what struck me, oh, well, lots of things struck me, but one thing quickly to share is, you know, if the if only is so tempting to go down that route. If only 50 years ago, when people were starting to talk this way, the powers that be had listened, we could have taken it at a nice steady pace. We wouldn't have done a lot of the damage we have already done, now got to undo. But we can't go back. We are where we are. I think what we must learn from that is, if we don't act swiftly now, in the next few years, it'll be even worse than if we don't. So, although it's difficult, and it's even when you're doing the right thing. I mean, Jim said they were thinking of putting solar panels in. Yeah, I mean, I've got a battery, you know, and I hear things about batteries, but I still think we've got to do that because we can't carry on using the fossil fuels. So we've got to find alternatives. We've got to use electricity, and there's going to be a transition period where there's going to be some real problems. No, I've talked enough. Who else would like to come in? Jim and Sue.
Hello, Jim and Sue.
Hi, yeah, I mean, I'm sure with the solar panels thing, when you raise the questions about the recycling and the solar panel rubbish, it is something to consider, just to be sure that you're not continue to contribute to the problem. But on a wider issue, what crosses my mind is the question about what should we be doing. I mean, I'm in awe of your grasp of the subject, and I think we've got the issue that it's really, really challenging. So on one level, you've still got your climate protest, you've got Just Stop Oil, you've got stopping the expansion of fossil fuels, but it seems that you've also got this huge thing of rebuilding human beings, as I think you intimated last week about the way Jesus is the model that we genuinely aspire to. But the question for me is actually, what do we do, and where do we put our energies in this kind of transition phase?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, what do we do? What do we do? My sense, and you may feel this is being defeatist, and which is fine, if you want to think that. My sense is the amount of effective leverage we can offer over the big picture is very limited. I mean, I don't think anybody, even at the highest levels, is totally in control of what's going on at the moment. There's so much going on in the world, which there's so much competition going on effectively that I think pulling together as a species to do the sensible thing, which we should have done 50 years ago, you know, as Barbara was saying, is becoming increasingly difficult. I mean, that's the tragedy of our situation. So my sense is that how we keep sane in this, apart from anything else, is by looking at those areas where we do have the ability to exercise some agency, and that's in respect of our own lives and in our local communities. I think that the more we can disengage from what's happening on the macro level, the better. The more we can take responsibility in our local communities for where we get our energy from how we deal with whatever waste we can, the better it'll be. Because I suspect looking at those four scenarios that that I've forgotten his name now, that David Holmgren looked at, if there is a sort of fairly sudden radical breakdown in communications and in energy networks, we will have to fall back to our own resources on a local basis anyway. And I would certainly feel personally more comfortable uh, effectively taking counsel and joining in, collaborating with people I know locally and trying to, manage whatever transition into an open-ended future lies ahead of us, than I would be sitting back and waiting for some authority figure to bestow bounty from on high, because I think the politics of this potentially become very fraught, they become very fraught really, because we've been used to living in a world where there's more and more energy available all the time. It's a bit like kind of being a kind of a pioneer in the Wild West, right? You can go as far west as you go, and if you fall out with your neighbor, that's fine, because there's always a new frontier for you to sort of explore and to exploit. And so long as the Native Americans don't get in the way, you're fine. And that's got increase in Lebensraum, which we've experienced over the last several decades, is something we take for granted. Now, if it's true that we're hitting limits, which I think we absolutely are, and it is interesting that the limits to growth report that came out in 1972, although it sat very lightly to particular dates in the future, it didn't want to be seen as making predictions about certain things. Actually, if you read through there, the 2020s did seem to be, in all likelihood, under a business as usual scenario, the crunch decade when things really started to bite seriously and limits effectively were manifesting themselves. Now, if we are hitting those limits, then competition at all kinds of different levels, including geopolitically, will almost certainly increase. So the more we can take responsibility for our own lives as local communities and secure some measure of local resilience in the face of what might come upon us really quite suddenly and unexpectedly, the better placed we'll be. That's the best I can come up with for the moment.
Yeah, Colin.
Colin.
You had your hand up. You're muted,
Colin?
Colin. You're muted, Colin. That's better.
Sorry, I lowered my hand instead of unmuting myself.
No.
Yes, thank you so much, John. I'm sorry I missed quite a lot of last week's one because I had a Holy Week thing that I had to do. But I'll try and catch up on it all. I did post a couple of somewhat strident comments in the C-Link email. Excuse me. But I think your slide with the 4 scenarios, the sort of everybody is calm and rational and sorts it all out, down to believe that if you like, yes, you're probably a Confucian scholar and people are basically all good and they just need a bit more information and education and guidance from a wise scholar leader. Yeah, we have lots of those, as you might have noticed, readily available worldwide. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting sarcastic and cynical. But the opposite end, and I noticed Catherine Fish put a comment in the chat there, that she doesn't want to be apocalyptic, but lifeboat scenario, which is the worst possible one, the Mad Max one, as it were, is what we see in Haiti, and it doesn't take much to tip a society into that if you take away fundamental resources. And I think that's the thing that strikes me. It's not just about energy and climate. Well, climate is the vector of lots of other crises: food, water, all kinds of, and as you mentioned, migration and so on. We ain't seen nothing yet in terms of some of these waves of crisis. And then probably there'll be another COVID, but it'll be more infectious, and we won't be able to produce vaccines as quickly and as effectively as we did. That may be the answer to the population problem. I mean, I'm really being pretty gloomy here and apocalyptic, but as regards what should the church do, I assent to your comment about community. I think my only the warning bell I would flag is that I think the church is still asleep about community. Because our idea of community is getting together one night a week and having tea and cake and a Bible study, or it's about maybe a little bit more taking the old folks to church because they're a bit mobility impaired, or it's about helping a few people out when they've had a baby or they've just come back from hospital or something else. But it actually just involves a little bit of an adaptation to our current lifestyle.
Yeah.
So you run around in your car, you go to the supermarket, you get a load of ready meals for them, and the problems are solved. Well, when the supermarket shelves are empty, you won't be able to do that. When you can't even get a can of beans, leave alone, the ready meals, because the factories have shut down, and the beans are not coming from France because France has a massive drought.
For sure.
As it already has been these systems are going to start breaking down, and we're going to need to discover about resilience. And by contrast, you go somewhere like in the so-called third world, or what they used to call the third world, or the global south. A Nepali, I believe, uses like a 10th or a 20th of the energy per annum that we use. And they're pretty much producing their own food. But of course, they have a relatively brutish, putting it bluntly, a brutish life. They don't have a nice national health service where you can run down the road and have your cancer dealt with, or have your teeth fixed, and so on. And I suspect that all of those things potentially will start to break down.
Thank you, Colin. I'm going to.
I'm sorry.
I want to respond to that. Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
No problem.
No, absolutely, Colin. I resonate with you. I think I can feel a sermon coming on again here, but I think it's really about Jesus again, isn't it? And I am really really concerned that we don't end up with a kind of Mad Max outcome here. And at the heart of the Holy Week message again for me is this sense of, Jesus did not play the game by those rules. People who came before him and after him essentially took up the cudgels of competition against the Roman authorities and sought to achieve political power by means of main force. But Jesus resisted that. And there is a piece, although I'm an Anglican priest, there is a piece of me that massively admires the Anabaptist tradition, particularly that element in the Anabaptist tradition that is radically pacifistic, and says that it's when push comes to shove in that way that the Christian difference is made manifest. So as resources become scarcer, the spiritual, moral resources the communities in general will need in order to essentially not start cannibalizing each other, where are they going to come from? Well, if Christian communities can't set some kind of a precedent, can offer some kind of a model for that, then I mean we might as well give up now. And I realize in different parts of the country, in different social settings, the church will have a different profile. I mean, I live in the Welsh Marches here, a very rural area, where traditional church in some ways kind of lives on in terms of the way in terms of the roles it's expected to play in local communities. So, I mean, I like to think we end up being relatively well placed. Now, in more urban areas, I think things are going to be potentially much, much tougher. Partly because population density is going to be much higher. People don't have their own gardens if they're living in massive skyscraper blocks and so forth. Already, during the times of plenty, problems of crime and of social breakdown have been endemic in some of these places. So it's in those more urban areas that I feel very anxious about how things might play out.
Thank you, John, very much. That was a very good, helpful response.
Does Terry want to say something?
Terry, oh, sorry, Terry. Come on in. We're going to stop shortly, but come on, we've got time for one more thought from you.
So thanks ever so much, John. I was aware of some of that, but not in such a way. And at one part, I think, oh gosh, we've got to give up. It's so awful. But we've got to keep fully aware of, if we do nothing, the climate will go on and make life as bad and worse than this. And I do think, as you were saying, John, in local communities, and I think church communities, I mean, our church is working very hard on the eco, and we're linking with other local churches in Chester to help in this respect. And there are senses of community. It's not spreading off outside church walls, but I think that community spirit will help on this difficult way forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I should say I don't mean to depress anybody really. But I do think, the truth will set us free, and we do need to be very hard-headed about what's coming up in future. I mean, I actually think the greatest proximate challenges to our way of life, it's not climate change. I mean, that I think is a very real threat, and certainly if the Gulf Stream shuts down, which it's looking slated to do sometime later in the century. Things are going to get a lot colder in the winter in the UK, actually, rather than warmer. But I'm very anxious about the geopolitics of where we are at the minute. I think that could go to a very bad place very quickly. And I'm also I think our financial system is basically hanging on by a thread, right? That could collapse again at any time. If it wasn't for the intervention of central banks over these last, however many it is now, 16 years, but we're living in a sort of suspended animation, situation as far as that's concerned. And we could well end up in a far more authoritarian context on the back of a widespread financial collapse, which again would have the effect of generating a sense of panic, but also I think of robbing individuals and communities of their sense of agency, because if we become increasingly dependent on sort of handouts from the state, effectively, I think that's not a healthy place for us to be as people, and certainly isn't going to do anything to help us take responsibility of the future and become the kinds of resilient communities that are going to be able to deal with the longer term challenges that we need to be. So yeah.
It is. Yes. It's called Mark. We'll make you the last question and then we'll bring it to a close. Come on in, Mark.
Okay, thanks very much, John. Once again, could you say something very quickly about the George Monbiot, Chris Smeji debate? And do you feel we can have a wee bit of both? That they don't have to be completely mutually exclusive.
Oh, right. I don't know if people are aware of what the George Monbiot. I don't know how to pronounce his surname. I did mention him last week. Chris Mage was supposed much. So the question is, how on earth are we going? What kind of pattern of life are we going to have in the future in terms of food production? I think that's the key issue, isn't it?
Yes.
Mark, am I right there?
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. Yes.
Okay, so Monbiot seems to have gone down the eco-modernist line, whereby essentially we're looking at a high-tech future which is seeking to maintain global population levels, and particularly urban population levels, as they currently stand. And that's all about sort of insect burgers and sort of vertical farms and all of that. And if you go onto things like the World Economic Forum website, you'll see people getting very excited about that. So people like Chris Smeji, or whatever his surname is, would argue that that's really not an environmentally friendly future at all. That actually this is simply doubling down on the kind of industrializing mindset that has got us into the mess that we've found ourselves in the first place. And my own instinct is that this is a far healthier, spiritually speaking, a far healthier response, whereby, again, it's looking about how local communities can reform themselves. Again, very much looking at that second scenario that Holmgren discussed, the Earth Steward scenario. Again, local communities taking responsibility for their own welfare in terms of food production as much as anything else. I think in reality, certainly if there's a short-term crisis that impacts on food production and distribution, I think we may inevitably some radical solutions will be expected of governments, and we could well end up going down the kind of path that George Monbiot outlines. And as I said, I mean, personally, I just have a gut dislike for that. I just don't feel that's congruent with the kind of calling that we have as people, really, and that repeating the industrial paradigm and perpetuating it in this way is ultimately going to just lead to an even greater crash somewhere further down the road. So yeah, I mean, that's, for what it's worth, that's my take on it. If you go to the resilience.org website, Chris Smeji has contributed to that quite a bit, and he has some very specific comments to make about the kind of eco-modernist approach. to these issues, and yeah, just commend that to you really as a way of getting deeper into this.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for, oh gosh, not only taking us deeply into our current situation and bringing us very much face to face with the reality, the situation that we are facing, but also bringing in aspects of spirituality and our Christian faith.